Hello, everyone. This is James Shore with Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. You're watching The Lab, which is where we explore, experiment, and generally mess about. And today in The Lab, we are continuing our series on front-end frameworks with a look at Ember.js, the framework for, well, as they say, creating ambitious web applications. Ember.js was created by Yehuda Katz, who is also the person behind the popular Handlebars templating library and is also a member of the Ruby on Rails and jQuery core teams. Ember has a lot of fans, so I'm really looking forward to getting into this. This is going to be a 2 or 3 part series on Ember.js. In this first part, we're going to look at what it takes to get Ember up and running. And in the next part, and possibly a third part, depending on how hard it is, we will look at design and architecture. In today's episode, we're going to look at Ember fundamentals. We'll start out by reviewing the application that we're building and the challenge that we're facing here with Ember. Then we will build a simple Hello World application, look at Ember.js components, continue on with modularity and testing, and close with my first impressions. There's a lot of material here, so you don't have to watch it all at once. You can use the timestamps here to jump to sections of interest or to come back in the future. And if you just want to see the results, as always, the source code is available at the link on your screen. Thanks for joining me, and welcome to the lab. Let's start out by reviewing the criteria for this investigation into Ember.js. As with all of my front-end framework and library reviews, so far we've done Angular and React in addition to this Ember review. As always in these, I'm not interested in what typical concerns that people have for these tools. Often when you read about front-end frameworks, you will hear people gushing about how easy it makes it to build some sort of application out of the box. Most often they're talking about a to-do app, unfortunately. I am not particularly interested in how easy a framework makes my work, nor am I that interested about how popular it is or how big it is or what its performance is. These are all useful things to know, and they are a component of a decision about which framework to use. But for me, the most important thing to know is how much is it going to cost me to support this application in the future if I use this framework. In many cases, a framework is an eternal choice. Once you make the decision to use a framework, you are stuck with it. Now, that doesn't have to be the case, and it's not always the case, but it often is. So if you're going to be stuck with something, you need to know that in the years, and I do mean years, that you will be supporting this application, will the framework cause you more trouble than it's worth? So I have 5 pitfalls that I look at. First is lock-in. Will you be locked into using this framework, or can you switch to something else? And with most frameworks, the answer is yes, you will be locked in. Second is opinionated architecture. Frameworks will often guide you towards a particular way of developing your application. That can be useful in the short term, but in the long term, it's often constraining. As your application needs grow and you do less and less common stuff and more custom stuff that really adds value to your situation that nobody else is doing, those pre-constrained ideas can become a straitjacket. Third is accidental complexity. How much time do I have to spend worrying about the framework versus the time I spend solving my problems? Do I have to worry about custom terminology or weird patterns or just lots of little glitchy behavior in the framework that I have to work around? Fourth, testability. Of course, this is always a concern for us here at Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. I want to be able to write unit tests, that is small, fast-running tests that don't have to leave the boundary of my applications, that are focused on very specific things, using off-the-shelf tools without a lot of mocking, without a lot of complexity or dependency injection or coupling in my test to the implementation of my code. And then finally, server-side rendering. Many front-end frameworks do not have the ability to run on the server, which means that you now have a search engine optimization problem and you have a performance problem. Search engine optimization is a problem because search engines like Google will go to the server and they'll ask for the HTML, but they won't run the JavaScript. Even Google, which does run the JavaScript, doesn't run it right away. It can be several days later, and it's not necessarily as reliable as just serving HTML. In addition, when a regular human being goes to your website and hits the server, if they have to get the HTML and then go back and get the JavaScript, parse it, and run it, there's often a notable delay before they see anything show up on the page. And with the prevalence of single page apps and frameworks these days on the web, you've probably noticed this. If you go to a web page and all you get is a little loading bar before you see anything, that's not fun. Server-side rendering resolves that. So what I would like is for the framework to support some sort of server-side rendering. It's not very common yet, but I do think it's important. So those are 5 pitfalls, 5 things that frameworks often get wrong that I look at when I'm evaluating a framework and considering how to use it, because I care more about long-term maintenance costs than I do about speed of initial creation. Now, the way that we're going to evaluate this is the same as in our other reviews. I'm going to re-implement the application I built in Angular and React and originally built in Java. This is a little financial projector application that has some parameters and then projects finances over the course of several years. Now, the details of how this application works isn't that important. The reason I chose this is because it's more complex than your typical to-do app, and because it has some unusual architectural choices that will allow us to more easily evaluate questions around lock-in and opinionated architecture. Specifically, one thing we're doing here is we're using aspects of Ward Cunningham's checks pattern language, specifically the whole value pattern and the exceptional value pattern. What these 2 patterns say is that everything that we see in the UI is immediately converted to a value object, and in our case, we're using immutable value objects. And whenever there's an error, that error is also represented as an value object. So if I type in 10,000 here, this string is actually a dollars object. And if I type 10,000x, this is represented as an invalid dollars object. And this leads to this sort of neat, immediately responsive display you see here, and the kind of spreadsheet-like results with the exclamation and errors propagating through. Now, again, the details of the application aren't that important, but I do think that this is an interesting design, and it has allowed us in the past to really see some odd corner cases of the frameworks that we've looked at. By the way, the checks pattern language, if you haven't seen it before now, is super interesting. If you haven't seen it before, I highly recommend taking a look at it. You can find it at this link here on your screen. All right, so that is what we are going to build. We're going to re-implement this app in Ember.js. First thing I'm going to do, though, is just write a little hello world. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I've got a seed project here that I've based on the Automatopia repository that I've got on GitHub. Right now, this is completely empty. It's just a flat out HTML page, but I do have it set up with some automation so that everything is being linted and we can serve the file. So if I go to localhost 8080, we'll see my little hello world page show up. Now what I want to do is modify this code to say hello world in Ember and start taking advantage of some of Ember's features. Already, a challenge that I'm having with Ember is that there's no hello world example readily visible in their documentation. They've got some pretty neat documentation, and before I started recording, I spent some time reading through their entire Ember guide from front to back, and it's well done. But one thing I have not found is any example of how to create hello world, or even how to create, a minimal application. We've got these examples on the front page that talk about application.hbs. This is the HTML bars template. HTML bars is based on handlebars, which is based on mustache, which is a templating language. Ember used to use handlebars, but now they use a variant called HTML bars that is more aware of HTML structure, hence the name HTML bars. If you're not familiar with these templating languages, you don't need to be that familiar with it. All you need to know is that anything that is surrounded in double curly braces, is interpolated. And because these sort of look like mustaches if you squint, that's why the original templating language was called mustache. And then handlebars riffed on that, and now we've got HTML bars. Anyway, so here's our template, but how do we hook this up? I don't know. There's no examples that I can find. The guide, which is nice, starts going into a really big application, which is the to-do. Anyway, it tells you how to do a to-do application, which is nice, but I just want to see hello world. There is also, if you go into the front page, you'll see the starter kit, which results in this right here. I've already got it brought up, which is kind of hello worldy. So I think what I'm going to do is try to do something like this. Anyway, I'm going to give that a shot. I'll be back in a moment. Okay, after a bit of fiddling, I've got Ember running. I haven't built anything yet. I haven't done a hello world, but I've got the script installed. And that was actually a little trickier than I expected because Ember depends on jQuery, but that wasn't documented anywhere I could see. But I did get an error until I had jQuery in. And you need this template compiler in order to do templates, presumably in order to do templates inside your HTML. Normally you would pre-compiler those, but I'm going to wait for that until we get to the modularity section. So I needed both of these things, and the Ember template compiler in particular isn't listed in the download section, which I found odd. So if I go here to the release builds, there's no ember.template compiler. So what I ended up doing was pulling the libs, the vendor dependencies out of the starter kit. So it wasn't not such a big deal, but it was a surprise. And now I've got this working without any errors other than this sort of old jQuery error. Now what I want to do is try to actually build something that runs out of Ember rather than just displaying hello world here. And I think the way I do that is by creating a script tag that has the type text/x handlebars. I think if we do that, then Ember will automatically find it and pick it up. I'm not sure. Ember has, unlike other frameworks that we've looked at, React and Angular, Ember really makes routing a first-class citizen, which in a way is unfortunate for us because our review doesn't, the review application doesn't actually do any routing. So we're shortchanging Ember a little bit by not looking at the routing aspect. But because routing is a first-class citizen, I think that makes getting started a little bit more complicated. And that's okay. I mean, I don't have a problem with getting started being a little bit complicated because you only really need to get started once and then, you move on. So again, this is about the cost of long-term maintenance rather than the cost of getting started. But I do think that this, for example, has something to do with their routing system. I'm not exactly sure what yet, even though I have read the documentation. Let's see. Let's go ahead and have this automatically restart when we change things. And that really did nothing. Anyway, so we've got our script, but it's not coming up. So how do we make this thing go? It'd be nice to know the answer to that. I'm guessing the answer is embedded somewhere in this app.js. Presumably, we need to make the application by saying ember.application.create. Let's try that. Hey, there we go. And look at that. You can see Ember has come up. jQuery has come up. Excellent. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So now we have Ember going. Don't feel like I understand this at all yet, but I suppose it will come. Okay, so this is our top level. Outlet, I believe, refers to our routing information. And I believe what we're expected to do is put our, so this is supposed to have our header and footer, and then our content that's going to vary based on our URL should go in this script. And I believe the ID equals index, it says basically this is what we show if we're on the home page, if we're showing this /index.html or / the directory. So if we put this in here, I think it will just automatically discover it and wire it up. Let's take this out and say index page. And if we refresh that, hey, it's working. A couple of things come to mind as I look at this. One is that if we don't have JavaScript working, or when this is originally served, the user is just going to see a blank page, which is pretty typical for front-end frameworks, but I'm still not thrilled with it. It'd be nice to have some sort of loading that we could override. I wonder if it is possible to do that, but I don't think I'm going to investigate that too deeply. I'm sure there's recipes out online for those who want to do that. Also, Ember is working on what they call I think it's fast boot or fast load or something like that, a way of rendering Ember on the server, which would make that moot. Other than that, I think what I'd like to do is try to do sort of a classic Hello World app where you type in your first name and your last name and it says hello, first name, last name. I think that will start to introduce some of Ember's core concepts. So let's see if we can do that. I don't remember the syntax for doing those sorts of inputs off the top of my head. It's something like this. I'm going to go ahead and research it and be back in a moment. Okay, I've got the syntax figured out. It's curly braces input, and then you put in basically your standard input properties. Now the difference, and those are listed in the Ember guide, and here's all your standard attributes that it supports. Now a difference here is that we can say the value is equal to some value, like that, and when we run it, that value will show up. But we can also say that it's equal to a variable, which I'm going to call first name. And if we do that, then Ember is going to automatically bind that, double bind that to the first name variable. And we will see this, we should see this appear, do the double binding, very similar to the way Angular does its double binding, in fact. Now, what's happening is behind the scenes. Now, as far as I know, based on what I've read, Ember has automatically created a router for us that has an index controller and an index model. Interestingly, Ember is going through a lot of changes right now. They're actually on a 6-week release cycle. They release a new version every 6 weeks. We're using 1.10. By the time you watch this, they may be up to 1.11, 1.12, or even further down the road. They are looking at eliminating controllers entirely and replacing them with components, which to me sounds like a good idea, actually. The controllers were basically view models as far as I could tell. They didn't have a lot of value, or they didn't add a lot of value over what a component does. So we will probably move to using components as well. But right now they're in this sort of awkward transitionary stage. We'll try not to hold it against them. Anyway, so what's happening is Ember is automatically creating a controller for us that I believe is just plopping these variables into an empty object automatically. I guess. I'm not exactly sure what's happening behind the scenes here. But what I do know is that, hey, there is our hello world and we've got some double binding. So now if I put in a last name as well, we could see hello, first name, last name, like this. And there we go. Wonderful. Now, having all this magic work is nice, I guess, but not really. I don't really like magic. I want to know what's going on because my experience is that when magic breaks, it breaks in very confusing and hard to understand ways. So what I want to do is turn this magic into something that we can rely on. So I want to go ahead and create the controller, explicitly create the controller that is being used here. And looking at the guide, if we go to the handlebars basic section of the templates section of the guide, it looks like what we need to do is make an application controller. It appears that Ember does a lot of string-based lookup or automatic binding based on strings. That's the impression I've gotten. So application is how you name the stuff that automatically runs when the application starts. Index is how you name the route that shows up when you're at the root URL or at a directory level, and so forth. So if I make an application controller like this, and I put it down here, will that just automatically pre-populate my first name and last name? Their example is using the same variable names I am. No, it does not. Is that because this is the index route rather than the application? If we put the first name here, would we see Trek? Yeah, okay. So maybe what we need to do is call this index controller. There we go. So that's how we initialize the values. Excellent. I'm not sure how I feel about this automatic lookup based on naming. It's not as bad as what Angular did, which used strings rather than actual object names or variable names. I know that Yehuda Katz, from what I've read, Yehuda Katz is a proponent of convention over configuration, which is why you'd see this automatic wiring up. Let's see how it plays out before we pass judgment on it. So we've created our Hello World controller. Now, as I said, this controller, you know, MVC has been around long enough, and it's faddish enough, it's popular enough that people like to call just about anything MVC. It's really hard to know what MVC means anymore because it's been used and abused so much. From what I can tell, in Ember, what they mean by controller is actually a view model. That is an object that is mapped to their template, which is rendered by a view object behind the scenes that I don't think we'll ever have to mess with. So that anything we put into the template, when we refer to some variable, it will look for that in the controller. And that goes for functions as well. I think we could say full name function return foo. Could we do that? And do we need to put parentheses on it? Missing curly brace. Help if I put a comma there. Let's try that again. Okay, not putting parentheses just renders out the function, which is good. That's what I would kind of expect. If we do put parentheses, it does not like it. So I think what we need to do is create a computed property, which is a special thing that Ember has that I read about in their guide. Let me go ahead and take a closer look at that. We'll be back in a moment. Okay, this aspect is a little bit weird. I was expecting that we would just be able to say call this function, but instead what we have to do is tell Ember that this full name is a computed property by appending dot property to it. And furthermore, what we can do is we can say, hey, this uses these other properties. And you'll notice here that in the example it has this dot get, which I assume we need to use in order for the binding to work. What's happening is that this property is computed on the fly. It's some sort of performance or caching mechanism. So if we wanted to make a full name that basically said this dot get first name space plus this dot get last name, if we wanted to have a property that put those two together, we'd need to do it this way. And then here we'd want to pass in to this property parameter the two things that we're depending on. It's kind of clunky. And it seems prone to error. And furthermore, because they're using strings here, if I use my refactoring tools in WebStorm, for example, let's say I rename this to first, it's not going to change these other things. Well, let's see if I've gotten this right. I think this will now give us the ability to, yeah, our full name is working. And this, of course, is how we can do something that's a little more interesting. Like we could say, give us the first name, but just the first character followed by a dot. And now it will give us, yeah, like that. Okay, starting to come along here. I wonder what would happen if I said this dot first name directly. Probably nothing good. Yeah. Well, let's put that initial back. It works just fine, in fact. Interesting. So why does this say we should use this dot get? Hmm. The other thing to note here is that in order to put this dot property magic on here, they're actually extending the function prototype, which is kind of a no-no. It is possible to turn that off though, so I'll give them a pass on that. I'm really not sure what to think about this dot get notation. I'm not a fan of it, and it's not clear to me why we need it, but I worry that if we don't use it, something will break subtly somewhere. I'm gonna go ahead and leave it in for now. All right, well, that's our hello world. However, that's not what our application is going to look like. As I said, Ember is migrating away from using controllers towards using components. And so what I'd like to do now is build a little component that does the same thing as our little hello world controller here. Okay, looking at this, the way you create a component is by giving it the name component slash whatever. At either as the ID or the actual location. And again, I'm not sure what I think about that. I don't really like organizing my directory structure by type. That just, in a large application, that just doesn't make sense. You want to organize it by function in most cases, but maybe that can be changed, or maybe I'm misunderstanding it. At any rate, to make a component, I think we could just say script type equals text handlebars, ID equals components hello. So there's our hello world component. And then to use it, it looks like it's just a simple matter of referring to it. Now it has to have a dash in it. I remember reading this in the guide, and that's just a quirk of the way components work, because eventually they want HTML bars to support saying hello world like this, and the HTML5 spec that deals with custom web components requires them to have a dash. So they're requiring a dash in it. That's a gotcha for sure. And that probably would have frustrated me to no end if I hadn't come across it in the documentation. They do define it loud and clear though, right here in defining a component. Thank goodness. Okay, so if I've defined this hello world component, I should be able to say hello world like that and have it just work. Will it just automatically pick up this component? Let's find out. Wow. Yeah, it just picked it up. So from there, I could potentially say, I could just move all of this into the component, right? Yeah. Now the JavaScript we wrote down here, this is for only on the controller. It's not on the component. So that's not working yet. But I'll bet you if I put first name, last name here like this, it will work. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I'm starting to like this. Now, how do we get the actual component to be created? Ember will look for a class with a camelized name of the component followed by component. Define a subclass of component. By default, Ember uses a div element. Interesting. Let's see what happens. Again, I'm really not thrilled by this convention-based lookup, but let's give it a try. This is the hello world component. Will that automatically just make everything work? Oh, it does. Look at that. Look at that. That is cool. Awesome. Well, creating a component was super easy. And it's quite a contrast to Angular with its weird magic. I mean, the difference between a component and a controller, very, very, very small. I'll bet you I don't even need this index route because we're not doing routing. Will that work? Seems to. All right, cool beans. Well, what I'm going to do now then is extend this with the mockup for our sample application. Remember, what we're going to do is build an Ember.js version of this app. And I've already got all the HTML and stuff figured out for this. So I'm going to mock this up with some components and be back in a moment. Okay, I've got this all mocked up with components. Well, let me bring up the Java version. So this is what we're replicating. Here we have a configuration portion with 3 fields and then a table with the results. And you can see here, we've got the same thing. We've got our header and footer with the application as a component in the middle. Then the component has a configuration panel and the stock market table. Configuration panel has 3 fields, which are just hard-coded right now. And the table has a header row and then a bunch of stock market rows. Unfortunately, and then the row has just got hard-coded data. Unfortunately, that doesn't quite work yet. And it's another gotcha in Ember.js, but kudos to their documentation. They made it really clear what was going on. And I spotted this when I first did my first read through of the documentation. By default, the components are surrounded in a div element. Was that a smart idea? I don't know. I like the React way of when you create a component, you return a single element and then React just deals with that element. Ember allows you to have whatever you want in your component, not just one element, but many. But in order to make that work, they have to surround it with a div. So if we look at the inspector, if we go all the way down into this, we can see that right here, the TR, the row, is surrounded by a div, and that's why it's causing the rendering issues. To address this, we have to define a component and put a tag name, which for this aspect of our work is a bit annoying. At this point, I just want to bang out a bunch of placeholder HTML. It's not too bad, and it really only affects this table row, but it'd be nice if it didn't have that gotcha. Anyway, I'll make a stock market row component, and that should just automatically get picked up. And then I should be able to say tag name tr. And what does that mean? Does that mean I don't need this tr anymore? I don't know. Let's run it and see what happens. Yeah, now we've got 2 TRs. Great. By putting that tag name there, now we don't put it here in the markup. That's confusing. I don't like that because now we've got eventually we'll put this in its own file, right? We'll have all of our markup here, and somebody who just casually comes along and looks at it will say, yeah, this component is a bunch of TDs. In order to know that it's actually a TR, you have to come down here to the JavaScript and look for the tag name. That's kind of clunky. But let's go ahead and run that, see if that actually fixes it. And there we go. There is our mockup. Now that we have our mockup working, it's time to look at modularity. There's 2 aspects to modularity with Ember. First, there's the scripts, and second, there's the handlebars. Now, just to remind you, modularity is really nothing more than taking our big monolithic file here and splitting it into multiple files that can refer to each other in a sensible way. And as I was looking into it, this is where I'm starting to see the first signs of trouble in paradise. Because as I was Googling and doing research for Ember on how to actually use common JS modules, which is the format I like to use with Ember, I was finding nothing, absolutely nothing. In fact, just information on how to break these handlebars templates wasn't turning up a lot, although I did find some good documentation on that in the end. Everything, and I do mean everything, was pointing me in the direction of something called Ember CLI. That is a command line tool you can install in Node globally to create an empty application for you. You say Ember CLI, or you say Ember space new space my app, and you will get this skeleton. And it looks like this monstrosity, this huge amount of stuff in here. Oh my God. And and it creates, it ends up creating like a vendor file that's 2.4 megabytes. I am not kidding about that. And of course, I wanted to know where all this stuff came from and I couldn't figure it out. And admittedly, I haven't spent a lot of time on it. But Ember CLI is the recommended way of setting up your Ember app. And it's interesting and for me frustrating because it really locks in a whole bunch of decisions for you. Ember CLI will create an empty application for you that has a cross-browser testing tool, Testum, a repository, Git, a testing tool, QUnit, a build system, Broccoli, a directory layout, which is sort of this Rails-style layout that I personally do not like, and probably other things too that I haven't quite figured out yet. This is the one way that they recommend you build your application. And I think this starts to speak to the question of opinionated architecture, because if you want to change those decisions, how do you do it? It's not clear to me that you can. For example, pretty much every decision they've gone with is something I would choose differently. I would use Karma instead of Testim. I'd use Mocha instead of QUnit. I'll use Jake instead of Broccoli. And I would use an entirely different directory layout. So I was whining about this on Twitter, and kudos to the Ember team. I got a couple of people who came back to me. I heard from both Katie Gengler and Tom Dale. And Tom Dale in particular is one of the people behind Ember CLI. And so he started asking me about what my intentions were. And it came down to this quote, which I think is really telling. He says, so I said, I'd like to be able to use other choices. He says, and Tom says, you can do it. It's just not on the happy path. Ember is all about convention and building solutions as a community. If you disagree with that idea or prioritize maximum flexibility above productivity, you're going to have a bad time. And that is really interesting to me. That says a lot about Ember's take on opinionated architecture. It is not necessarily wrong. I want to be clear about this. The approach Ember is taking is not necessarily wrong. It is a conscious decision on their part. It is, however, a decision that I would choose differently. I actually assume that if you're working in an application, you're going to want to do things differently than what the community decides, either because you just like other things better, or because your needs are different. Either way, I want tools that don't lock me into specific decisions. And it's just icing on the cake that every decision they've made is pretty much the opposite of a decision I would make. But really, kudos to Tom and Katie for seeing my whining and reaching out to me and being very, very non-confrontational about it. So thank you to both of you. But this does make me worried if we're going to try to build something that's not using the Ember CLI model, because first off, I don't know what's going on here. And for me, it's really important that I understand what's happening in my application. And there's a lot going on here, and I don't want to take the time to figure it out. Second, even if I did understand what was going on here, I want to do things my own way, partly because that's just the way I like to do things. I've got certain ways I like to do things, just like anybody else. But more so for the purposes of this review, I want to see how hard it's going to be. So let's see how hard it's going to be. By default, Ember just does everything in a global variable, in this case called app. We need to do two things. We need to take this script and put it in its own file and then have that work using modules. And second, we need to deal with all these handlebars templates, get those split out into their own files as well. I'm going to start out by just taking this script and turning it into an example.js. That should be really straightforward. I'm going to take this here, put it here, and then include it. And yeah, that should just work. And everything seems to be working just fine. Now, though, what I want to do is I want to convert this to use Browserify and CommonJS modules. I'm going to do that in two parts. First, I'm just going to make this one file a Browserify bundle, and then I'm going to split out this component into its own file. Okay, so far so good. I have got this working with Browserify and a bundle file. I've modified the example.js to be wrapped in an IFI, and you can see it's not setting any global variables. IFI is an immediately invoked function expression. And this is working. Now, what I'd like to do is actually separate this out a bit further, and so we can have our stock market row component. Now, how is that going to work? I think it's kind of neat that with our mockup, we really don't have a need for much JavaScript in here at all. It's all in our handlebars templates. But we do have this, and I do want to split that out into a separate file. If this was my entire application, I probably wouldn't, just to keep everything together. But for the sake of understanding modularity, I do want to go ahead and split this out. I want to make a UI directory, as is my typical approach, and put a stock market row.js. And I'm kind of tempted to call that stock market row component. But the question is, I think I can take this and I can put it in there and have that be module.exports equals that. and say here, require UI stock market row. I think if I do that, I think this code will work. Actually, it surprisingly didn't work. Probably because app isn't global. Yeah, look right here. App is not defined. Oh boy, this is going to be a pain in the ass, isn't it? There's nothing online that I can find about how to do this, which says a lot about opinionated architecture. You do it Ember's way or you're screwed. Or that's how it feels right now. I'm feeling pretty, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to check into this back in a few. Okay, I was able to get this to work by explicitly making app a global here. And then this app was looking up the global, and now everything's working just fine. I wouldn't say this is good. No, in fact, I would say it's not good. Is there another option? There might be. Inside of Ember, the way the lookup is done is with something called a resolver. And it is theoretically possible for me to write my own resolver. But that sounds like a giant waste of my time. What a pain. What an absolute pain. And we have run into this right away. It's locking in so many choices. Angular did the same thing. What is with these frameworks that have to tell me how to do modules, for crying out loud? All right. So anyway, let's just call that a loss. Ember's support for other module formats. But I did sort of figure out a way to make it work. What I did here was I've gotten rid of the window.app global by creating the app here. Now the app global is being created by Browserify because that's my export from example.js. That I think is okay. It is my top level export. And then I'm setting up the stock market component here in my top level example.js and pointing that at my stock market row. So that way, at least my stock market row doesn't have to know which app it's being used in. And in my research into the way people have addressed this problem, mostly what they're doing is they're writing little scripts to automatically create this series of require statements. I'm not thrilled with that, as you can probably tell from my tone of voice and what I've said so far, but I guess we'll make it work. All right, let me go ahead and check this in. Now that's just part one of the problem. We also need all of these handlebars templates to be in their own files too. We don't want these to all be in our index.html. Now, Ember does have a tool for compiling these templates down somehow. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but starting with Ember 1.10, Ember has this Ember template compiler, and it's not obvious where you get that from, but if you download their starter kit, it's in there. This is actually runs in the browser, but can also run from Node. And I'm not entirely clear how that works, and it's a little weird. I'd rather npm install it rather than having to go into my vendor directory. But I should be able to pass some handlebars files to this and see a result. So I'm going to go take a few minutes to try to figure that out, and I'll be back in a moment. Okay, I think I'm getting somewhere here. I've imported or required the Ember template compiler, and then called the precompile method on it, which as described in this blog post. And this information is in a blog post. It is not in the Ember guide or API or anything like that. You've just got to find it. Anyway, what you're supposed to do is read the file in, call the precompile, and then export it. There's no API here, no documentation here that I have found. So what does this false mean? I don't know. But that's what they have. So let me go ahead and pass it in and see what comes out. Yeah, I don't know what that false means. But the result of that is a nice little immediately invoked function expression, which in their example here, they wrap in an ES6 module, which again, I'm not using, and then they stuff it out. I guess what I can do is pull these templates out of the index.html, stuff them all in one big templates.js, and then put them next to the bundle.js. Definitely, it's clunky. You know, Ember is definitely not following the Unix philosophy. They're not doing lots of small tools that you can chain together. They have one giant And in my current mood, I want to say monstrosity that sort of all fits together. And Ember CLI is exemplifies that attitude perfectly. Rather than giving me a little tool for compiling templates, they've given me this sort of function that isn't documented anywhere except in a blog post and is assumed that you're going to be using their Ember-CLI monstrosity and not have to worry about it. But for those of us who want to, keep things small and understood and know what we're dealing with instead of just using third-party tools blindly, there's not a lot of help. Anyway, I'm going to try pulling out this stuff into files and then modifying our build script to take all those files and smash them together and hope something nice happens. Well, I have burned a couple of hours on this now, and I think I figured it out, but it was not a fun journey. It turns out that the documentation they give you about how to compile templates is really only half the battle. Because once you've compiled a template, you've got to fit it into Ember's magic look stuff up system. So I got to the point where I could compile the template, but it would not show up in my output. And that's because I wasn't telling Ember about it. It didn't know what the template was. It didn't know how to find it. The solution in the end was fairly straightforward, and it is even documented. It is part of the core Ember namespace. There's a property on it called templates. If you put a template into this templates global hash, then it will be automatically picked up. But there was nothing really pointing me to that, of course, because they want you to use Ember CLI. So what I ended up doing over several hours of trying lots and lots of different stuff, because remember, I didn't know this templates global existed, so I didn't know what to look for it. So I was just trying all kinds of stuff. Eventually, I started searching for the ID that you put in your index to make a handlebars template. I started searching through the Ember CLI created vendor.js for that string, and I found it, and I saw this ember.templates, and light dawned, and now I have it working. But it was not fun. Let me just say that. It was not fun at all. But now that I have it working, if we put component/example application in there, exactly as we do for our ID when we describe a template, then it works. It works perfectly. So that's good. Now, there's one little problem, and that is that as I was Googling around and I looked into this, I discovered that they're getting rid of ember.templates or plan to step away from it. So what we're supposed to do instead is use the Ember resolver, which is here, which is a whole nother can of worms and not nearly as simple as just tossing something into ember.templates. I'm going to ignore that for now and see if I can get this working with just the ember.templates and properly componentizing everything. And then we might look into using a resolver, just because I hate myself and I want to make things painful. Anyway, I'm going to do that back in a few. Okay, that worked. I've got all of the handlebars templates except all the component templates pulled out of the index.html, and you can see them here in .hbs files. Now, this is not idiomatic Ember. Idiomatic Ember puts components in a component directory, but I do not like that sort of stock Rails style directory structure where you put things named by their type rather than putting things that are related close together. I want my stock market row controller, or whatever this is, and my stock market row handlebars, HTML bars, to be next to each other because they're very tightly coupled. When you change one, you're likely to have to change the other. And I want them all in a UI directory. So I have ignored the idiomatic Ember and done it my own way. And I'm very happy to say that I could. I was pretty worried when I was looking at Ember CLI and thinking that I had to do things their way. It was not easy to figure out how to do it the way I wanted, but it is possible, and that's important. So this is the code. It's not cleaned up particularly, but what I'm doing is I'm getting a list of HBS files from the component templates dir, which is just source client UI. And I'm looping through it, and I'm reading the files, figuring out the template name based on the file name, which says strip out all the path information in the extension and replace underscores with dashes. That's the template name, and then I stuff it into a template string, which I then write out to templates.js, which leads to this, giant file, which is generated and we can just ignore. So that's not too bad. There's a couple of things left to figure out. One is that this is still very magical, and Ember likes its magic. They call it convention over configuration, but I call it magic. And so if you were to look at example.js, you would have no idea how these templates are coming in. And especially since I'm doing a custom build rather than just using the stock Ember CLI, you're really not going to know. So I do not like that. Right now, when I look at application.js, it's really not obvious how everything fits together. I mean, yeah, you can sort of intuit it, but I would like for this information about how things fit together to be defined here in application.js. And this is a big difference in philosophy between me and the Ember folks. They love convention over configuration. I like explicit configuration over convention. I think what we can do is write our own resolver, which we will then put into this application.js. And what the resolver does is tell Ember where things come from. And on top of that, as I mentioned earlier, the templates approach of defining where templates are, putting them in ember.templates global, that is being deprecated, or at least there's rumblings from the Ember people about it being deprecated or being moved away from. So we can kill two birds with one stone here. We can get rid of this reliance on a global, and we can make our application more readable by making it more explicit, I think, by defining a resolver. And the way we do that is here, when we create our app, we just say, hey, the resolver is, and then a class. So I'm going to just call it example resolver, and that is a class name. And then our class is something we can just have extend the default resolver. And then we can say resolve template and then give it a function. And then our code is going to go here. And I think we can also take advantage of this technique to really clean up some of the common JS stuff as well. Because right now it's not obvious. It's not obvious that the templates are being brought in the index.html. We could, if we have our build script turn the templates into a common JS file and then include those in our bundle, then in our application, we should be able to do something like var templates equals require templates. And then we'll add a comment. This file is generated from our HBS files by the build script. So again, making things explicit, defining this connection. So if somebody really wants to see how that templates is created, they can go look at the build script. Yeah, I'm liking this. And now what we can do is, so we've got our templates, we can just say templates parsed name, and that's that. Now we've resolved a template. So that's what I'm thinking. I think if we can do that, that would be pretty cool. And if we call this a common JS resolver, it makes it even more obvious what's going on here. Okay, I have got that done, and I am pretty happy with how it turned out. I had to make a few tweaks. The common JS resolver class had to be defined before I used it, obviously. And just for safety, I defer to the parent class if we can't find the parse name. Originally, I had this throwing an exception, but it turns out that we are asked to resolve the name, index, and other names in certain circumstances. So I don't think the superclass is going to do anything. It's not going to know how to resolve any templates that we don't know how to resolve, but I put that in there just for safety. So there we have it. It's a proper common JS resolver that works with my preferred file structure, and I'm really happy about that. So just to refresh your memory, what we've got here is we've pulled out our HBS, our HTML templates into their own files, and we've pulled out all the JavaScript into its own file using common JS. And the common JS dependencies are a little bit clunky. We might be able to make it better with the resolver at some point in the future, but the handlebars or the HTML bar stuff is actually pretty clean. So that is modules. In the end, I actually am pretty happy with the way Ember dealt with this. It was really frustrating. I spent hours, and I do mean hours, trying to figure this out. But in the end, it's pretty clean. Ember is opinionated, but it is flexible. It has this resolver, which is really nice and clean, allows us to do it our own way. So the problem was really the documentation, and I can cut them some slack on that. The actual API is solid, so kudos to them for that. One thing I did notice as I was looking at this, though, was that Ember is changing so rapidly these days that Googling for information often leads you to out-of-date information. It may still work, but it's no longer the current recommended practice. It's a bit bittersweet in that, yeah, the API is really solid for something that's opinionated. It does give you the ability to hook in there and do things your own way, which I'm very happy about. But the documentation doesn't really help you, and Google will often bring you to out-of-date information. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Now that we have modularity worked out, it's time to look at unit testing with Ember. And I have to say, I'm really not looking forward to this. I've already spent 2 hours trying to figure out how to do unit testing just by researching the material and looking at the starter kit code and incidentally actually looking at the Ember source code. I've spent more time looking at Ember source code than I have for any other framework. And I still have no clue how this is supposed to work. And I think I just need to dive into it, but I was hoping to come at it in the recording with a bit of, advanced knowledge. I'm feeling pretty frustrated actually about the Ember documentation and the Ember approach to things. Ember assumes that you're using QUnit, and all their examples are in terms of QUnit. They never really show you how to set things up in their examples that I've seen. They just talk about bits and pieces of it. The sample app that you get out of the starter kit only uses QUnit. The stuff you get out of the Ember CLI only uses QUnit. So I have no idea, and it's all magical, right? It's all supposed to do things for me. So I have no idea what's really happening under the covers. I know that the resolver is involved some way. I don't know. It's confusing, and I'm frustrated and annoyed. And this is very typical of Ember, it seems. Like when I first read their documentation, I thought to myself, wow, this is great documentation. I'm really happy with this. But now that I've gotten into it, I'm finding that the documentation is out of date. It has odd holes. It makes things sound simple, but that's because it's ignoring things that you have to know in order to get this stuff to work if you're not just following their happy path. Anyway, to make a long story short, I don't know how to do unit testing with Ember. All their example code is for QUnit. They have a QUnit helper, but they have no set of generic test helpers that I can find other than this third-party thing that the QUnit uses that is written, by the way, using ES6 modules and doesn't even work in Node or the browser. And if you want to make it work, you have to compile it down yourself somehow. Oh my God. It's been a pain. Like I said, over 2 hours just trying to figure out enough so that I can make sense when I start recording on it. Anyway, so yeah, I need to figure out how to unit test something. What I'd like to do is just test that our stock market row component has the TR tag. Just that simple. And how do we do that? No idea whatsoever. Okay, I've gotten some basic test infrastructure working using Karma as usual, and I've got IE8 just for fun, IE11, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, and the iOS simulator running here. A nice set of browsers just to make sure that, if there's any cross-browser issues with Ember, I'd like to find out about them. We have seen it in the past, particularly with Angular, so this will be useful. All right, I did end up spending a couple more hours on it, followed by a nice long rest and some beer and some really delicious meatballs. So I am feeling better now. And I think I've got it figured out. Hallelujah! And also, thanks very much to Trek Glowacki, who is a member of the Ember.js core team who helped me out. Sort of. He listened to me rant and he offered some pointers and eventually I was able to figure it out. So thank you very much, Trek. Anyway, I'll just walk you through it. We set up the root element, which must be Ember testing because everything in their test code is hard-coded to use that ID right now. Then we call setup for testing, which prevents the app from actually running. Then we have to say set resolver. We either create a default resolver or we have to make a custom one. We've kind of done both here. We're telling it that application is using the global namespace app I'm not sure how necessary that is because we're not actually setting up app as a global, but it seems to be working anyway. I don't know. And then before each test, we tell the app to reset itself because the documentation told us to. And then, and here's the here's the thing that was just driving me crazy as I was doing my initial research on this. There is no way that I can see using the Ember API to get tests to work. Instead, what you have to do is use a different library called Ember QUnit. And if you look at the official API documentation, that's all you're going to hear about. Let's see, where can I find it? Here it is. Ember QUnit. It's the default unit testing helper suite. And like with everything else I've run into with Ember, if you don't, as I was told before, if you don't use what they want you to use, you're going to be having a lot of pain. Well, you know, some of us like to use Mocha. A lot of us like to use Mocha. Some people like to use Jasmine. Other people will want to use their own testing framework. But if you're not using QUnit, screw you. Ember QUnit is the way to go. Well, luckily for me, somebody else involved with Ember pointed me towards Switchfly, who happens to be the person who works on Ember QUnit, who has made Ember Mocha, which is a test helper for using Mocha with Ember. And this code, well, there's a lot to it. There is a very, very lot to it. You cannot actually test Ember with a unit test without using one of these helper libraries because there's just so much going on. And what the helper library does is it basically takes the test library and wraps it with its own special functions. And I really dislike this decision on their part. Rather than giving us some agnostic functions that we can integrate on our own and then adding onto that some sort of convenience helper, no, you've got to use their things. Describe component, for example, is like describe in Mocha, which says, you know, here's a group of tests, that also does some sort of, and I have no idea what, some sort of magical setup under the covers to make this all work properly. And is there overlap between what this does and what I'm doing here? Quite possibly. I really don't know, but if you look at the source code, and I have looked at way more Ember related source code than I ever expected to, and that I have ever looked at any of the other frameworks I've reviewed, you can tell I'm still a little frustrated about this. If you look at that code, you can see that it's doing things like creating this Ember testing div at some point. Or maybe it's just relying on it. I don't remember, and I don't think I can find that code again now. At any rate, there is some magic going on here. Of course, that magic is not documented. You're just supposed to use it, trust it. Everything's going to be fine until it stops working. And then you're scuppered. Anyway, it works. I did this and it works. This dot subject is the component in question. This dot $sign is jQuery after the component has been rendered under the covers. And when we do this and we put out the jQuery HTML call and the tag name, we get, check this out, we get something that actually works. And there's our contents and there's our tag name. Hallelujah. It works. So now I should be able to say expect component, because remember, all we're doing here, all we're doing is the very, very straightforward expect that this line of code was written right. Expect component dot tag name to equal tr. So if I do that, what do we get? Success. Yay. Of course, this isn't really doing much other than just looking at this value, but I think that's good enough because again, when we write our test, we don't test the framework, we just test that we're using it properly. So there we go. And if we wanted to take this a little bit further, we could also say expect component dot inner HTML to equal, and then we could toss in our inner HTML. Now, I actually would not do this in most cases because that doesn't really seem like a worthwhile thing to test. Oh, it's not component dot $sign, it's this. So this is set up by describe component to be a magical look things up thing, and it's doing stuff under the covers that are unknowable without looking at the source code. And I actually looked at the source code a lot, and it's not really knowable even looking at the source code. And there we go. It's working, and it's working on all the browsers. I was a little concerned because there's some hard-coded references to Chai in the Ember Mocha code, and IE8 does not work with Chai. But this does work on IE8, and that is cool. So there's just this magic boilerplate, and then this that we just have to kind of take on faith with this approach. The most frustrating thing about it is really the documentation was not very helpful to get me here. Once you go off the beaten path with Ember, you are in deep weeds, and there's enough magic going on with the default path that the documentation doesn't really tell you how to make things right when you go off into the deep weeds. And this code is pretty nasty. What I'm going to do is start taking out some of this boilerplate here and see what we need, what we truly need that isn't handled for us by the described component magic. I asked Shrek Glowacki about this, and he said the reason we needed to do it this way is because of dependency injection. That's what he said, but I think what he meant was that Ember is a dependency injection framework that manages dependency injection for you, and if you don't go through, say, describe component and the resolver, then it won't set up the dependencies correctly, and your component will be missing some necessary properties. But what we don't need to do is we don't need to be duplicating our CommonJS resolver because the app has a resolver on it. We should be able to just say app.resolver.create like that. Yes. And that means we can get rid of this duplicate CommonJS resolver, which is already defined here in our application. And now I think what we can do even further is bring this code out into a unit testing setup or a UI testing setup file. And I'll put that in underscores as I tend to do. So what we can do is we can take this code, all of it, put it inside of our UI test setup. And then a feature of Mocha is that if we make a before function call that's not inside of a describe block, it will run before all other tests. So there we go. We'll put our app here and require it in this directory because we went up a directory. We'll say set up for testing before anything else runs. We'll set the resolver. And then before every test, we'll reset the app. Hopefully they'll pass lint and pass tests, and it does. Hallelujah. Okay, in the end, as with the modularity, this turned out to be pretty clean. I'm not as thrilled with this part, though, as I was with the modularity, although I honestly was not that thrilled with the modularity either, but I was very happy to have figured it out. I'm also very happy to figure out this test stuff. However, this described component and what's going on here, it's deep magic, and it worries me because my concern is that as we dig into this further, when things break, I'm going to be at an utter loss to fix it. And for those of you who are not interested in using Mocha or QUnit, you are kind of out of luck. What they had to do this is it's not just a little convenience function. It's not something you can replace in your own code. You have to dive in deep to their Ember test helper and re-implementing or implementing on top of this. This, of course, is only written with ES6 in mind, so you're going to have to write some transpilers as well. You're up for some pain for any test library they don't support, and I do not believe they support Jasmine. So if you like Jasmine, keep that in mind. I do have high hopes, though, that now that we've got this working, the actual test library itself is going to be pretty good. We've got all of jQuery available to us, of course, which is quite useful. And Ember has a bunch of stuff that they call integration testing that actually runs in the unit test framework as well, which we may not end up using, but is good for any type of routing testing that you want to do. So overall, I feel fairly positive about where we are going to go from here, but figuring this out, I mean, it took 5 hours for the unit test stuff, a lot of scratching my head, a lot of help from Ember core team members, which I'm really grateful to them for doing that, but I don't consider it a very positive sign for the quality of the documentation and the framework that I needed that. But at least the tests are working. All right, first impressions. Well, this has been a painful experience, but in Ember's credit, it's always a painful experience. I hate setting up a new library or framework. I just hate it. It's such a pain in the butt. And I am very deliberately doing things the non-Ember way. Now, the problem with Ember is that I knew going into it, it's described as an opinionated framework. I knew that going into it, but it surprised me to the degree to which they're not just opinionated about their architecture and design, but they're very opinionated about their tooling. So opinionated that if you don't use the exact tools they expect, and some of them are kind of bizarre choices, and by bizarre I mean out of the ordinary. Broccoli, QUnit, ES6 modules, Testum, Git, and a Rails-style directory layout. These are all assumptions that the framework makes throughout its documentation and its tooling. And if you deviate from those assumptions, and it's a large list, so you're likely to want to deviate from at least one of them. If you do, you're in for a world of hurt, and it's really not fun. It's one thing for a framework to be opinionated about design and architecture. I don't like that. But being this opinionated about basic tooling choices, in my mind, that is a step really way too far. And the solutions they provide, the bias towards doing things for the you rather than with you is frustrating. I am still at the point where if things break, I'm in trouble. And the problem with this sort of magic is that you very quickly get to the point where you have to understand how the magic works, why it works, and when to use it. We had to get into this resolver right away. In order to do testing, you have to be able to set up that resolver again. It's really not something you can escape. And the resolver at first for me was not obvious how it worked. If you're still not clear on it, what this does is this converts strings into modules. Well, you can see it here in the test. It thinks internally of a component as stock-market-row. It turns that into not stock-market-row.js, but stock-market-row component, and looks for it on the app namespace, and we set that here. The resolver is how that happens. That's the default behavior. You can't overwrite it. And the reason they do that is because they are also a dependency injection framework because, well, magic. The good news, though, is that other than everything seems to resolve around this resolver, I suspect we may run into some ramifications of the dependency injection magic at some point, but the magic I've found so far really does revolve around this resolver. And now that I've figured it out, it's actually not that bad. There's also this magic for the test, but I'm hoping, I've got my fingers crossed that we can just accept that and run with it. So first impressions, too opinionated for my tastes. Too much control over tooling. Oh my God. But the core design of Ember, that looks really positive and really strong. And if the worst thing I have to deal with is understanding this resolver, then we're in pretty good shape. Next time, we are going to dig into a lot more as we finish taking our example application and actually implementing it out. That will get us to look at design and architecture, and we'll look at the very critical question of how opinionated is Ember when it comes to design. Will it be able to work with my wacky-ass design that uses immutable value objects, a mutable domain layer, and Ward Cunningham's checks patterns? I'll be really interested to see that. I hope you will join me next time when we go into it. Thanks very much for watching, and I will catch you next time.